20 May 1945. Stuttgart. In a ruled clerk's notebook salvaged from a bombed office, a 33-year-old bookkeeper named Karl wrote a line he could not have spoken aloud. "If we tell the truth about what we did and what we allowed, we will not be able to live among each other, so we will rebuild with silence." He set the pencil down. He looked out a window with no glass. The city was a field of red brick dust and broken timber. The cathedral's ribs were exposed. The air smelled of damp ash and latrine pits, and the faint sweetness of lilac on a hillside that had not been shelled. This is how it began for millions of German civilians. Not with fanfare, not with parades, but with a ledger of losses that had no column wide enough for the numbers. The mathematics of ruin. The Americans had entered Stuttgart on 21 April. They posted proclamations on surviving walls. Curfews were imposed. Weapons had to be surrendered. Radios tuned to Allied broadcasts. The ban on fraternization was still in force. Men like Karl were instructed to stay home unless ordered otherwise. Women were ordered off the streets after nightfall. There were leaflets and loudspeakers on jeeps and white flags tied to door handles. The rubble had to be moved. The city was not a city until its arteries were cleared. In the weeks after the surrender on 8 May 1945, the Trümmerfrauen formed their lines, mostly older women and girls, often wearing men's trousers and headscarves. They passed bricks from hand to hand, scraped mortar, stacked salvage. Archivists photographed them. Allied occupation reports counted their hours. In June, the city registry in Stuttgart noted that 119,000 apartments were completely destroyed. Another 100,000 were badly damaged. The arithmetic of a home was now piles and lists. Karl's wife, Lotta, had stitched sacks from old curtains to carry rubble. She came home with a cough and an extra potato. She said it was payment for a day's work. She put the potato on the table and stared at it. Their apartment was a room and a half. There was a cot for their daughter in the pantry. The neighbors' infants cried after midnight. The water came from a standpipe in the courtyard when the pump worked. You learned to wash in a bowl and pretend to be clean. On 13 May, the American military government's public safety branch sent an officer to inspect the city's police. The officer filed a report. He wrote that uniforms were patched and morale was poor. He noted that many had been party members. The Americans would purge and then restore. The mathematics of control had to balance against the mathematics of hunger. If you removed everyone who had joined the party, who would move the bricks? Who would keep order when the black market would soon become the only market? The fear of retribution was real, and it was complicated. In the first weeks, rumors traveled as fast as hunger. The Russians were far away here, in the American zone, but stories of revenge shootings and rapes in the East spread through women's talk and men's whispers. At night, people crouched behind doors when boots echoed in stairwells. In Stuttgart, on 16 May, a soldier was shot near Rotabulplatz. Some witnesses said it was an accident. Others said it was provocation. The Americans cordoned off streets. They held inspections. They made an example of curfew violations. The city learned the arithmetic of being occupied. What could be said? What could not be said? Where to stand when a jeep passed? Missing persons notices multiplied. They were written in neat script on scraps of paper and pasted to a charred kiosk. They were pinned to notice boards near the church. Searching for Paul, born 1910, last seen in Posen, January 1945. Lieslott, age 8, hair blonde, eyes blue, disappeared in air raid of 28 July. The city clerk's ledger of births and deaths shuddered under numbers that did not converge. The mathematics of absence is not just addition. It is subtraction without remainder. In an Allied intelligence summary for the month of May, Analysts wrote that German civilians exhibit a beaten demeanor, a combination of relief and sullen resentment. They logged fragments of overheard conversations in market queues. If only the Führer had died in 1942, we might have been spared. The Russians will come, you'll see. We are not like them, we are civilized. The summary listed the statistics of calories per day and the estimated reserves of coal. It did not list the inventory of grief. The first post-war summer brought sudden storms and bursts of heat. It brought flies. It brought slow, careful hope. Karl volunteered to stand watch at a warehouse where sacks of flour were stacked. He watched for thieves in the dark. He kept a notebook. He wrote down names when the sacks were moved. He wrote that he did not sleep. He wrote that there were men in the lane who looked like ghosts in work jackets. The war was ending and not ending. Displaced persons, liberated and dislocated, moved through. On 20 June 1945, a German police bulletin recorded that a truck had been stopped near the Stuttgarter Bahnhof. It carried women from a camp near Wildbad. They were Polish forced laborers on their way to a repatriation point. Some came into the city to trade. They stood in front of shop windows with nothing behind the glass. They smoked American cigarettes and looked at Germans who looked away. The mathematics of shame is hard to compute. Near Nuremberg, at Langwasser, thousands of Polish and Soviet DPs occupied former Wehrmacht barracks. In Bavaria, at Feldafing and Ferrenwald, survivors of the camps gathered under the administration of UNRWA, later the International Refugee Organization. The files are in the Bundesarchiv and in Allied reports. They describe the distribution of condensed milk and DDT. They describe Jewish committees organizing schools and bakeries behind barbed wire. They describe German farmers selling eggs over the fence. They show a reality that would not fit into the stories that many Germans preferred to tell themselves later, that the victims lived next door and spoke with accents and wanted no contact, that they existed as witnesses and therefore as threats. In September, the American military government required every adult in their zone to complete a denazification questionnaire. 131 questions. Party affiliation. Party rank. Organizations joined. Contributions made. What did you read? Did you attend rallies? Did you donate to the Winterhilfswerk? Did you serve in the SA? Did you join the NS Volkswohlfahrt? For men like Karl, this was a ledger line he could not ignore. He had joined the party in 1937. He had been a bookkeeper at an engineering works that switched to armaments in 1942. His main job had been to track payroll and delivery schedules. In the fall of 1943, his office had processed the wages for French and Polish workers, forced laborers housed in a fenced compound near the factory. He had seen them lined up twice a day. He had recorded their names. He had signed off on deductions for food and housing that they had no choice about. He had never hit anyone. He told himself this matters. On 2 October 1945, he filled out the questionnaire. He wrote that he had joined the party for career reasons. He wrote, Mitläufer, follower. He asked his neighbor, a pastor, to sign an affidavit. In the language of the time, it became a Persalschein, a Persalschein, a Persal certificate, named after a laundry detergent, an affidavit of good character to wash away stains that would never come out. In December, a letter came. He was called before a Spruchkammer, a denazification tribunal, in February. The structure of denazification was a mathematics of categories and letters. Major offenders, Hauptschuldig. Offenders, Belastet. Lesser offenders, Minderbelastet. Followers, Mitläufer. Exonerated, Entlastet. In the American zone, the Spruchkammern began hearings in early 1946. Volunteers, often Germans with no party record, staffed them. They sat at tables in cold rooms with thin files and long lines outside. Carl's hearing lasted 20 minutes. He sat, he explained. He said he had been a bookkeeper, not a policymaker. He had joined in 1937 after pressure from his supervisor. He had not attended rallies after 1939 because of work. He had voted yes when he was supposed to vote yes. He had never denounced anyone. A British intelligence report from the summer of 1946 observed that a large proportion of those examined now present themselves as reluctant participants. The files show the trend. The mathematics of guilt moved toward mitigation. He was categorized as a mitläufer and fined. He was barred from supervising others for a time. He was allowed to work. The system needed stability as much as it needed justice. The law, Control Council Directive Number in Vetic 38 demanded that Nazis be removed from positions of influence. The economy, bleeding and broken, demanded that someone keep the ledgers. The story widened into millions. Denazification questionnaires were processed for roughly 13 million people across the Western zones. The Americans began sternly. They softened by necessity. The British were skeptical from the start, favoring administrative removal and quiet rehabilitation. The French were severe in some districts and inconsistent in others. The Soviets moved faster and harsher in their zone, seizing factories and land, arresting many, and installing new administrations with a different mathematics of guilt and necessity. Allied occupation reports noted the churn, noted the resentment at being questioned, noted the fatigue of those doing the questioning. The other movement was east to west. From Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland, millions were expelled and fled. Treks of carts and refugees crawled along muddy roads. Allied directives endorsed population transfers to prevent future ethnic conflict. The result was a human inundation. In October 1945, a town in Hesse of 12,000 recorded the arrival of 4,000 expellees in 3 weeks. In early 1946, villagers in Upper Bavaria watched strangers come into farmyards and stand awkwardly. They did not bring furniture. They brought paper bags of photographs. Karl's city felt it in the arithmetic of rooms. A municipal housing officer wrote in January 1946 that one apartment of 3 rooms, intact, was required to house 4 families. He wrote that the city would allow partitions, that ovens would be shared. He noted that fights were increasing. The files list brawls over bedtimes. They list complaints about the smell of strangers cooking. They list acts of kindness. A woman in Hallstrasse took in a widow with 2 boys and never asked for rent. A teacher wrote to her cousin that the newcomers spoke in a dialect she could not understand, and that the baker showed them the stale bread first. The arithmetic of food was brutal. The hunger winter of 1946–47 came early and stayed. January was ice on the inside of windows and frozen latrines. Coal trains did not arrive. Water pipes burst. Men hacked at railway ties with trowels. Ration cards promised calories that did not materialize. The official ration for a normal consumer dropped at times below 1,000 calories. For heavy laborers, it was higher on paper and lower in reality. People in cities took hamsterfahrten, hamster journeys, into the countryside to barter blankets for potatoes and jewelry for a sack of flour. American officers, in weekly reports, documented the spread of swollen ankles and hair loss. They noted that small black coffins were carried in quiet. Cigarettes became currency. 4 packs for a pair of shoes, 1 pack for a haircut, 10 packs for a sack of rye. American brands, Lucky Strikes, Camels, were bright coins with soft edges. Black marketeers moved through alleys with coats over their arms. There was a word for them, Sheba. Pushing and skimming went hand in hand. Police reports tracked raids on scenes lit by flickering candles. They catalogued arrests of boys with tobacco-stained fingers and veterans with sharp jaws and stolen flour on the floor. The mathematics of the black market was not merely greed, it was survival and the ethics of hunger. A woman traded her wedding ring for a ham. A man sold a sack of flour to 3 different people and fled. The neutrality of money failed, cigarettes took its place. An Allied intelligence summary in March 1947 noted that moral norms are eroded under the pressure of need. It listed percentages of arrests and compared them to those in 1938. It did not count the nights people lay awake waiting for the knock. In towns near DP camps, the proximity was a pressure on conscience. After the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the adjacent DP camp housed thousands. British reports describe incursions into nearby German farms to retrieve stored property and food. In the American zone, in Landsberg and in Stuttgart's environs, German civilians saw what had been done in their name. Here, the phrase is exact and imprecise. It was in their name because the regime had claimed to speak for them. It was imprecise because responsibility bled into a mass that resisted measurement. Diaries from 1945-47, preserved in the Bundesarchiv and in oral history projects, show a palette of responses. "We did not know" appears often. So does "we could not have done anything." In a notebook found in a Stuttgart attic in 1993, a woman wrote in October 1945, "I walked past the camp on Bubblinger Straße. The barbed wire is still there. There are children. They look like my Hans, except thinner. They laughed at a dog. I gave them a roll." The guard frowned, "But let me pass." Another, in a letter to her sister, "They say the Jews are asking for their silver. Our mother's forks have initials. Do we have to give them to someone?" The mathematics of restitution stirred the dust of kitchens. Denazification hearings produced their own literature of self-description. The categories insulated, the language provided. Major offenders were few, followers were legion. The numbers told a story. In the American zone by 1948, less than 1% were classified as major offenders or offenders. A larger group was tagged as lesser offenders and fined. The vast majority became followers or exonerated. The mathematics of guilt had to meet the politics of the Cold War. By 1947, Washington's attention turned to the Soviets and to Reconstruction. Military government directives softened. Spruchkammern were closed or transformed. A British occupation report in July 1948 recorded a tendency to forget. It added that morale improved when factories reopened. Factories did reopen. The Marshall Plan arrived with crates stenciled USA. In Stuttgart, the first shipment of oats came in August 1948. Care packages turned into family rituals, canned meat, chocolate, powdered eggs. In archives, there are photographs of children in woolen hats grinning with a banana. There are notes from American officers describing how food stabilized political attitudes. The arithmetic of forgiveness was measured in calories and coal. On 20 June 1948, the West introduced a currency reform. The old Reichsmark, battered and inflated, was replaced by the Deutsche Mark. 40 new marks were given to each person, a sum delivered at school tables and town halls. Q photographs show philosophy professors beside housemaids, old party members beside their victims, faces turned toward a possible normal. Shop windows transformed overnight. Goods appeared. Herbs, soap, shoes. The black market faltered. The cigarette lost some of its value. The mathematics of scarcity became more bearable. The new currency was not just money. It was a promise that paper might again mean something honest. Karl got his 40 marks. He looked at the blue-green bills and smelled the ink. He went to a shop on Königstrasse and bought a loaf of bread that had not been announced on a ration card. He bought a bar of soap and shaved with a new blade. Then he walked to a city office where he had been told to report. He became a clerk in the building department, the Baum. He would spend the next 10 years issuing permits for walls and roofs. He sat at a desk with a blotter and a rubber stamp, beneath a calendar showing a winter field with a fox. He wore a tie again. He took applications from men with missing fingers and women with burned hair. He checked lists. He calculated allocations of bricks and timber. He considered which street deserved paving first. He wrote notes to himself in a small notebook, numbers like mercy. Never enough. With this work came a new mathematics. The arithmetic of reconstruction was allocation. The arithmetic of guilt was administration. A former Nazi engineer with skills in concrete got permits quickly. A man who had hidden a neighbor in a cellar in 1944 waited for cement because his forms were incomplete. In the files are cases. The building of a school on a street named after a poet. The repair of a synagogue that had been burned on Kristallnacht. The minutes of a meeting where council members avoided the word synagogue and said simply, the building on Hospitalstrasse. Words could be rationed in the same way as bricks. Karl told himself he was merely doing his job, that the forms were neutral, that the mathematics did not know politics. He knew it was not true. On 1 April 1951, the Federal Republic passed Article 31 of its basic law, the 31 Law, allowing for the reintegration of former civil servants who had been dismissed. The Baum received a flurry of applications, men and women with old files asking for pensions and posts. The personnel office smiled and shifted papers. Politics had returned, quieter than before. No flags or drums, just signatures and back pay calculations. Stability required experience. Experience had a past. In schoolrooms, the curriculum shifted gently. New textbooks spoke of the rise of National Socialism as a national misfortune, a tragedy. They emphasized the suffering inflicted by bombings. They narrated the treks of expellees as emblematic of endurance. The horrors committed in the East were noted in paragraphs with passive verbs. The camps were described, the dead counted, and the blame allocated to the leadership and the SS. The arithmetic of memory is addition and selection. Public commemorations honored the dead of the city soldiers and civilians, without listing those whose names had been erased. There were moments when the sieve failed and hard facts pressed through. In 1949, the trials in Nuremberg had finished. Justice had a number of names. German newspapers printed them in columns and then moved on to advertisements for bicycles and sewing machines. In 1952, the Lastersgleichgesetz, the equalization of burdens law, promised compensation to those who had lost property in the East. It was a redistribution of future taxes, paid to the dispossessed. It was fair and imperfect. In files, claim forms detail furniture inventories and orchard sizes with a precision not applied to other losses. The mathematics of restitution was growled about in beer halls and debated in parliaments. It coexisted with the fact that Jewish survivors often returned to find their accounts empty and their neighbors reluctant to talk. The mathematics of justice and its asymmetry. In the East, in the Soviet zone, then the German Democratic Republic, an entirely different myth was written. The fascists were blamed entirely on the West. The anti-fascist state did not have to interrogate its own complicity. Its denazification was swift and ruthless. It was also a tool. It placed guilt on opponents and laundered it from those who embraced the new party. In the West, the Cold War was the new arithmetic. The Berlin blockade had begun in June 1948. The airlift helicoptered bread and coal over a divided city for almost a year. The front line did not run through trenches. It ran through power stations and air corridors. It ran through school lessons and cinema schedules. Carl's desk moved to a new office when the city built a modernist city hall. He learned to love the sounds of normal, the clack of women's heels in the foyer, the clatter of a mail cart, the ring of a telephone, and the phrase "Bauamt, Guten Tag." He avoided the DP camp on the outskirts. It was smaller now. Most had left. He avoided because he had once signed off on a pay sheet with the name of a man who had died in a camp. He had searched for that paper and thrown it away. He told himself that the paper was not the man, that the man was not the paper. He knew the opposite was true. He was rehired as a trusted official after his Mitläufer status was washed down to exonerated in 1950. The personnel file bears a stamp and a signature. The paper looks innocent. The signature is rounded. He learned to shake the hand of a man who had worn the uniform of the SA. He learned to say, "We were all young then," as if youth were a defense. The days made layers. In October 1953, his daughter stood in a classroom with a teacher who paused at the word Jew and then continued. In the city, a makeshift memorial to the victims of the dictatorship leaned against a church wall and fell over in a storm. In August 1954, a new Volkswagen drove past a man with one leg on crutches and the shine reflected in his eyes. It was a decade after surrender. It was a different country on paper. The economy boomed. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had a rhythm. New factories, new washing machines, new suits. Men who had once been thin now gained weight. Women had permanent waves. Old ration cards gathered dust in drawers. American firms licensed technologies. German engineers built on what they had known. Newspapers reported that exports were up and unemployment down. The mathematics of prosperity began to overshadow the arithmetic of guilt. Not to erase it, but to bury it under new bills and new songs. Allied occupation reports shifted in tone. From lists of arrests and seizures, they turned into charts of industrial output. The Control Commission folded into embassies. The flags on the bases stayed but did not scold. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. The Bundeswehr formed. The stigma of arms softened. Young men in new uniforms stood at attention, and older men looked at them and looked away. Denazification had long since ended as a formal process. Its legacy remained in the files of Spruchkammern, stored in municipal basements. The files were grey-brown folders with frayed strings. They waited for future scholars. They waited for sons and daughters who would ask their elders what they had signed. The verbs would again be passive in kitchens. We were carried along. We were deceived. We followed orders. The mathematics of denial repeated itself in small loops on winter evenings. Contact with victims did not cease. A Jewish family, the Feitels, returned to Stuttgart from Switzerland in 1950. Their shop had been Aryanized in 1938. They applied for restitution. The records show that their claim was questioned on the grounds that the price had been fair according to the laws of the time. They argued that a law that forced their sale could not be fair. The commission awarded partial compensation. The Feitels reopened with new shelves. People came and bought shoes. People did not mention the past. Or they did, in whispers, in lines like, "They are back," as if the return were an act of aggression rather than of survival. In 1952, the Adenauer government signed the Luxembourg Agreements, agreeing to reparations to Israel and to individual survivors. The public debate was bitter. A crowd in Bonn shouted that Germany had no money. Newspapers printed letters saying one could not pay for what could not be priced. A theologian wrote that money could be a beginning. He was shouted at in a beer hall. This is how democracies argue with their shadows. There were also stories of unexpected resilience. Among the expellees were women like Anna from Breslau, who came in February 1946 with two sisters and a box of family photographs. She worked in a cannery. She married a widower with a small garden. She named her daughter for a river they could not return to. The daughter became a teacher and opened a school club where, in 1958, she screened a documentary about the camps. The principal tried to stop her. She insisted. The mathematics of memory shifted by inches. In Karl's office, a man named Franz, who had lost his right hand in 1943, stamped applications with his left. He used a wooden prosthesis to steady the paper. He hummed a hymn sometimes. He told a young clerk that the song calmed his breathing. The clerk asked what he had done during the war. Franz said he had been a driver and left it there. He had driven crates somewhere. He had delivered something to a place with a gate and never asked what was inside. The gate appears in his file. The place had a name that was in a long list printed at Nuremberg on thin paper. He would never say it. The Cold War pressed into small spaces. In June 1953, when workers in East Berlin rose, people in the West listened to radio broadcasts. They learned a new arithmetic of fear, mapped by missiles and ministries. The war they grew had changed its geometry. It ran through train stations where travelers were searched, and through television broadcasts that ignored inconvenient anniversaries. Schoolbooks softened the Nazi period into a preface. Teachers spoke of the Weimar Republic's failures, of the hunger for order, of the magician's trick of mass persuasion. They made charts. They drew Germany as a patient. They left out the faces of neighbors who walked with torches to break windows. They left out the faces of those who stood and watched. They celebrated rebuilding as a moral project that validated everything else. The arithmetic of national narratives rounds up and rounds down. In 1959, in Frankfurt, prosecutors prepared for a series of trials that would examine crimes at Auschwitz. They assembled witnesses. They requested files from the states. They found empty folders and quiet rooms. The press began to print names. Younger journalists asked questions their elders had not wished to retain. Karl read a headline and turned the page. He had secrets. He wrote them in the margins of his notebook, the same one that began in 1945. He wrote, April 1943. Remembered the list from the foreign laborers. I signed it. It was a wage and a prison. I stamped it and went home to supper. Then, in another line, 1951. The man with claims for pension. S.A. man. I shook his hand. I told myself it was for the job. Then, 1958, saw a woman cry in the DP camp cemetery. I looked at the grass as if I were under orders. He wrote these lines between lists of timber and repair costs. This is what compromise looks like when it wears a tie. There were moments of goodness that he did not know what to do with. In 1946, Lotta had sneaked a loaf of bread to a Polish girl and been scolded by a neighbor. In 1950, Karl had argued, gently, for a permit to repair the synagogue's roof, calling it the right thing. He did not tell anyone that he had cried quietly in the archives when he came across the original building plans from 1904 and saw the neat pen strokes of a man who had dreamed of a different time. He did not tell anyone because the mathematics of public confession and public forgiveness did not add up. The files hold everything. Allied intelligence summaries with footnotes. Denazification files with clipped affidavits. Occupation reports with percentages and calories. Bundesarchiv records with maps of DP camps and the shifting lines of military government. Oral histories with the tremor in a voice when an old man tries to pronounce a Polish name for the first time. They hold contradiction and sincerity and lies told for survival. They hold the arithmetic of a society recalculating what it thinks it knows. On 17 June 1961, Karl walked past a bookstore window where a new book about the camps was displayed. He stopped. He looked around. He stepped closer. He read a paragraph with words he knew but had not allowed himself to meet. He walked away. He returned 2 hours later and bought it. He put it in a brown paper bag and took it home. He read it at night with the curtains drawn. He slept poorly. In the morning, he went to the office and signed 3 permits for garden sheds. The day returned to its arithmetic. In December 1962, he took out the notebook he had begun in 1945. He wrote a final line at the top of a page where the paper had turned yellow. The war after the war is the quiet division between what we remember and what we agree to forget. He put the notebook in a drawer under a stack of ration cards he had kept as talismans. He tied the drawer shut with string. He sat with his hands folded and listened to the clock. The city outside was lit for Christmas. The windows reflected the lights. The cathedral had a new roof. The trains ran on time. The children who had once begged for sweets in the street now studied Latin and typed their homework. For the men and women who survived 1945, the front line did not end. It ran under sidewalks and through court records. It ran through the numbers on pay slips for forced laborers and through the signatures on restitution payments. It ran through rooms partitioned with plywood and through school books that simplified and soothed. It ran through expellees' suitcases and through DP's watchful eyes. It ran through Carl's ledger and his breath. He finished his work in 1965 and retired. He tended a garden. He kept his chest of notebooks. He watched young people in 1968 march with flags of a different color and shout about a different war. He read the newspapers about trials in Frankfurt and about a wall in Berlin. He wondered about the arithmetic of a life in which a man could be careful and still be wrong. He had written his first sentence on 10 May 1945. He wrote his last in 1970, weeks before he died, in the same trained hand that had once filled out ration books and permit forms. We rebuilt with silence because we could not speak and still live next to one another, and all my life since, the front line has not been in a trench but in the memory I keep and the papers I file.